How do we keep the planet moving towards a greener future? It doesn't happen without driven entrepreneurs and inspired social impact leaders like you. This podcast will give the tools and insight you need to join the sustainability movement and save the world. This is Thinking Green with Mohammed Abdallah.
Welcome back, Thinking Green Nation. This is your host, Mohammed Abdallah. And today we're going to be jumping into the ERCOT shortages. So a little bit of a background story. ERCOT, which was formed in the early 2000s, stands for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It's a nonprofit organization that is responsible for managing the Texas grid. So first up, we are going to look at Snowmageddon, or the Texas Tundra event, which happened back in February 15th, 14th, 2021. And it was a deep freeze that overwhelmed the Texas power grid and knocked out electricity for more than 4 million Texans, leaving them without heat. According to a recent report, the actual toll on lives were close to 700 people. So most of Texas is on its own power grid. This decision was actually made in the 1930s to keep it clear of federal regulation. This means that Texas both avoids federal regulation, that in the sense that it can't import electricity during periods of high demand. It means that it can avoid federal regulation, but it also means that it can't import electricity during periods of high demand. So as temperatures began to drop, people turned up their electric heaters. They needed more power than engineers had been told to design for. The thermal energy sources that supply most of Texas's grid were not properly weatherized. Wind turbines froze, and the demand for natural gas spiked and created a shortage. So with all that kind of coming into effect, those frozen instruments, as well as the shortages, were the major culprits. And to keep electricity prices low, ERCOT had not really prepared for such a crisis. But for example, El Paso, out in West Texas, which is not part of ERCOT, but is actually linked to a larger grid with other states and is thus regulated. It did, in fact, weatherize their equipment, or they did, in fact, weatherize their equipment, and their customers only lost power briefly. So the fact that you have this Western interconnect that ties the entire Western continental United States in terms of their power grid, and Eastern interconnect that does the same. And then you have ERCOT, which is standard Texas, right? Its own little island where they manage the wholesale power cost, the transmission. They oversee it all and make sure that each party is playing according to its rules. Now, as I mentioned, the fact that it avoided federal regulation also meant that it couldn't import more electricity during periods of high demand is exactly the reason why Oklahomans and other folks that were affected by the snowstorm back in February were not affected, because they were able to pull in power from neighboring states, whereas Texas was not able to do so. So what ended up happening, we had power outages for many that lasted days. As a result, you had people that needed medicine and medical devices that couldn't power them. You had families huddled up around the fireplace trying to stay warm. You found water pipes that started busting throughout homes because the walls weren't properly insulated, and they frankly just, our building code is not meant to be able to survive or withstand these types of accidents and natural weather events. So you had a plethora of problems start to occur due to the fact that our power grid could not handle the inclement weather. Our homes were not built to withstand these types of weather events. And frankly, there wasn't enough distributed architecture, distributed solar, battery systems on the grid to be able to take a lot of those homeowners that were struggling, a lot of those businesses that couldn't operate, off on their own little microgrid to help power them through the storm. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because last week, ERCOT was another hot topic for a lot of Texans throughout the state. The reason why was because we're in the middle of June and ERCOT announces last Monday for everyone to start conserving their energy. They rolled out what they call their alert level 1, which says, hey, they quote unquote like to call it tight grid conditions. So tight grid conditions pretty much refers to ERCOT's nice way of saying, if you don't start conserving power, then you're going to start seeing rolling blackouts. And the reason why is because a lot of the generators, a lot of the plants that are typically ready for these types of events were offline. So about 12,000 megawatts of power were offline. 9,600 of those were natural gas plants. The rest were turbines that didn't perform to their expectation in the summertime. And so you have what's happening is you have these really tight grid conditions, of which now ERCOT is going out to the citizens throughout the great state of Texas saying, we need you to adjust your thermostats. We need you to lower your power usage and power consumption so that we can make sure we don't lose more and more of our reserves and we're not forced into a rolling blackout situation. This is really unusual for this early in the summer season. Funny enough, a lot of homeowners in recent news articles and whatnot came out and were like, hey, my thermostats were being controlled by the grid. And they had actually they had actually signed up for these retail energy plans that gave the retailer the ability to go in and control the energy usage of that homeowner's HVAC unit in the event these demand response scenarios occurred, right? The demand response where the grid is like, hey, we have an increased amount of demand on the grid. We don't have enough supply, and we need y'all to go ahead and respond to this peak demand event by lowering your energy usage. So a lot of these homeowners started to see their thermostats creeping up to 77, 78, 79 degrees without them even knowing. Probably somewhat of a blame on their end for not reading through the contract and the agreement that they signed up for. But funny enough, a lot of them woke up to, sweaty naps and started going over to the thermostat and realizing that, the grid or the retailer had actually increased their temperature so that they could save some of the demand that was on the grid. It's no question, there's no denying the fact that power grids, they have to be kept in balance at all times as it relates to supply and demand. The concern around the Texas power grid is as more and more Texans move to the great state of Texas, as more and more folks move here from California, New York to Ohio and elsewhere, as more and more demand for technology, energy demand for electric vehicles, which we're going to get into here in a second, continue to increase the demand on the electric grid that's about 100 years old. How are we going to be able to manage the demand with the supply that we currently have, especially with a greater and greater push to weatherize our generation assets, a greater and greater push to make them more sustainable and lower their carbon emissions and greenhouse gases? How are we going to continue to do that with intermittent sources like solar, which only powers your home or business when the sun is shining, or with the wind whenever the wind is blowing? And the solution, in my personal opinion, is the distributed architecture. What does that mean? The distributed nature of rooftop solar and energy storage coupled with it. There's nothing that can solve the issue that we have ongoing for the next 30, 40, 50 years of our grid that cannot be resolved with distributed solar and storage. More and more distributed systems taking pressure off the grid during peak demand periods, during hot summer afternoons when people are pumping their AC units, during cold winter blizzards when the grid cannot maintain the supply needed because electric heating is so energy intensive. The true solution needed for the 21st century is distributed solar and battery backup systems. Your rooftop is a power plant. Your garage is a big battery that can store the power generated off of your roof and discharge it when you need it the most, when the grid needs it the most, and when the grid simply cannot maintain itself because of its age, because of its fragility, because of its poor overall design. That's when distributed solar and storage wins. And just to take a quick pivot and go off on a little tangent, electric vehicles, folks. What are electric vehicles going to do to our grid when they become mainstream? When I'm running my house, when I'm powering my house, I'm typically running off of 500 watts to 1,000 watts. If my AC unit isn't on or my oven, none of my heavy loads, just kind of a phantom 110 volt outlets. I'm using between 500 watts and 1,000 watts. The second that I plug in my Tesla Model 3 and I have it on a 60 amp breaker pulling 48 amps continuously, I'm actually drawing closer to 10 to 11,000 watts. That is nearly 10 to 20 times more energy usage than my traditional home pulls. Now imagine I get an electric car, my wife gets one, my neighbor gets one, my neighbor down the block gets one. A couple of them maybe get a new F-150 that's just been released that charges from an 80 amp plug. The more and more electric cars that enter the market, then Amazon buys 1,000 or 1,500 of them, then Walmart, and all these other corporate retailers. Now everyone's running a fleet of electric cars. Now everyone needs to charge their electric cars from the grid. Guess what wasn't built to be able to maintain and support that? Our electric grid. So what does that mean? That's going to make it incumbent upon us to reinforce either our electric grid or reinforce the distributed nature and create a new distributed nature of a power grid that allows people to put rooftop solar and battery backup systems with good financing mechanisms at affordable rates with 5-star services. And that's the key to being a long-term player, someone that's looking to transform the energy ecosystem, because you and I both know that the demand for electricity is not going to go down. There's just more and more data centers, more and more servers, more and more electric cars, and a fleet of them that will soon enter every major retailer and small business in America. There's only more and more cryptocurrency mining. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And then on the flip side of that, there's only less and less generation assets from coal and natural gas. There's more and more intermittency from solar and wind. There's not enough energy storage that's being installed on the grid to be able to support the grid. And even if there were, they need massive amounts of batteries on the grid to sustain an extended inclement weather event. So there's so much to consider here, guys. But the important thing to be thinking about ultimately is, how are you building the resiliency that you need? Because ERCOT is not building it for you. The shortages that y'all are seeing, the ones that happened back in February when we didn't weatherize our equipment, the shortages that we saw last week because of an increased demand in June and a low amount of generation plants and plants that were offline getting maintenance. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. If y'all think that these are one-off events, you're absolutely wrong. You're going to have your money taken from you. Just understand that you have to do whatever it takes to build energy resiliency, and you have to do that because ERCOT's not going to do it for you. So get on the train, build your energy resilient home, business, make sure that you can maintain business continuity, that you can have asset protections and you don't, have busted pipes because you didn't even have a battery that backed up the blower on your gas furnace. Do not do that to yourself. Asset protection, business continuity, energy security and resiliency, rate protection, long-term savings. The list goes on and on and on. And let me tell you something, guys, ERCOT is just going to become more fragile. The grid is just going to become less and less reliable. The weather is just going to become more and more severe. Electric vehicles are only going to become more and more prevalent. Do yourselves a favor and make sure that you make a smart investment into your own distributed system that can operate independent of any larger grid, force, control, power, authority, whatever you want to call it. Because if you don't, you're going to be saying, I wish I did, and Mo told me so. Y'all have a great rest of your weeks. If you have any comments, leave them below. Make sure to hit the 5-star rating, subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Check out our main headline sponsor at goodfaithenergy.com, a 5-star premier local solar and battery backup company located in Texas. Thanks, y'all, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your weeks.
Thank you for listening to Thinking Green with Muhammad Abdallah. This episode was brought to you by Good Faith Energy. For more information, check out goodfaithenergy.com. Make sure you subscribe, give us a review, and leave a 5-star rating. If you like this episode, share it with a friend. See you on the next episode of Thinking Green.